George Friedrich Handel. George Friedrich Handel lived from 1685 through 1759. As you probably recall, he was born in the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685. He has a really unusual name. Take a look at it. His first name is an English name. His last name or surname is German. Although it is given an English pronunciation, make sure you call him Handel and not anything else. And notice that his middle name is a very strange looking name indeed. It's something between the English Frederick and the German Friedrich, but neither of those two. These details of his name are well worth considering because, in fact, his name tells us something about his life in reverse. If you read his name backwards, you can tell something about his biography. Indeed, if you start with his last name, a not uncommon surname in the German-speaking world, you can determine that he was from the German-speaking part of Europe and he was born in a German principality. If you take a look at his first name, George, you can tell where he ended up spending most of his adult life. Handel had his career in England. In fact, he spent almost all of his very long adult career in that country. Although there are only two composers in this unit, Handel and Bach, they do have certain details of their biographies in common, so you have to be especially careful with them. For example, both of them were born in the same year, both of them were born in German principalities, and as you can see here, both of them were famous organists. So you'll have to look to other details of their biographies to tell these two great composers apart from each other. Indeed, a good point of comparison would be to determine how good they were as employees. Although Bach held a series of jobs, both as a court musician and as a church musician, he always discharged his duties faithfully, and he never gave his employers any reason to dismiss him. The exact opposite is true of Handel. In fact, I would describe Handel as being not a good court musician. Not that he wasn't a good musician, but that he was not a good employee. For example, when he got his first job with the Elector of Hanover as his court composer, Handel found one excuse after another to be out of the German north. He spent a number of years in Italy learning the Italian operatic style so that he could go home and write such operas for the Elector of Hanover. And then when he finally returned there and actually resumed his duties, he again found excuses to go off to London to test his essays in Italian opera on the English public. He ended up extending his stay in England and eventually he settled there for good. He probably was a bit embarrassed when the Elector of Hanover, his former employer, became George I of England. The two of them, however, got along very well indeed, despite Handel's transgressions. So when you think of Handel, think of someone who was not a good employee and compare him with Bach, the faithful employee who was always around, did his job from beginning to end, and never wandered off to another part of the world completely. Since Handel was so obviously ill-suited to being an employee, it probably is just as well that he worked for himself. He worked as an impresario. An impresario is basically a person who produces and directs elaborate stage productions like operas, oratorios, ballets, stage plays, etc. And Handel made his living doing this throughout his career in England. Again, you have another point of comparison with J.S. Bach, who always worked for others. Handel worked, for the most part, for himself. I'm certain that I've told you before that the composers of the past rarely wrote music just for the fun of it, and they certainly did not waste their time writing music that was not going to be used for some purpose or that was going to offer them some sort of an advantage. And you'll get a chance to see this in the career of Handel in England. In fact, he basically worked for the public when he was an impresario, so he had to gear his musical production to English musical taste during that time. And his career in England breaks down into roughly two decade sections. The first half of it runs from the 1720s through the early 1740s, and during this time he focused on the genre that was popular in England at the time. That is Italian opera. Not English opera, not German opera, but Italian opera. I know it must seem strange to you that a composer from the German-speaking world should move to the English-speaking world, and there that he should be writing Italian operas in order to make a living. Well, the explanation for this is very, very simple. In England at the time, no one would have paid a penny to go to hear a German opera. Certainly, opera in English was not well esteemed, or it would have been produced in abundance by composers of that time. But Italian opera was in style, and you know, whatever is in style is exactly what people want, and that is exactly what will sell. So Handel wrote Italian operas during the first half of his career in England. When the vogue for Italian opera had run its course among the English public, and after Handel, in fact, had lost the considerable fortune that he made producing such works over the two previous decades, he turned his attention to a different kind of composition. So from the early 1740s through his death in 1759, he focused his efforts on oratorios. I shall refer to these two halves of his career again. Make sure that you can tell one apart from the other. Know their approximate dates, know the genres on which he focused, and there will be one more detail that you'll learn in just a little while.